Some Negroes wanted to be fully accepted by the whites, while other educated Negroes wanted nothing to do with them. These two ends of the extreme caused frustration, friction, and failure, with the sacrifice to be made with either position. So let's take a look into the mind of the black elite to understand how they became trapped between two worlds. And we're going to continue reading from the 1940 book titled Dusk of Dawn by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Excellence. It goes without saying that, while Negroes are thus manifestly of low average culture, in no place nor at any time do they form a homogeneous group. They're not all the same across the board. They may identify as Negroes, but there are cultural and character distinctions within it. Even in the country districts of the Lower South, Allison Davis likens the group to a steeple with wide base tapering to a high pinnacle. This means that, while the poor, ignorant, sick, and antisocial form a vast foundation, that upward from that base stretch, classes whose highest members, although few in number, reach above the average not only of the Negroes but of the whites, and may justly be compared to the better class white culture. Negroes had a very large percentage of ignorant and poor people who made up the wide base of the group, which is understandable due to being blocked off from the higher paying jobs, which only very few of them were able to secure. Now, this is not the case for today because most black Americans are not poor. So this has been major progress in this area. But in the 1940s, it was the opposite. And from this wide base of poor, ignorant folks, it tapered into blacks who were culturally on par with the better class of whites, which had been the case for some time. The class structure of the whites, on the other hand, resembles a tower bulging near the center with the lowest classes small in number, as compared with the middle and lower middle classes, and the highest classes far more numerous in proportion than those among blacks. Their most numerous class came from the middle ranks. This, of course, is what one would naturally expect, but it is easily forgotten. The Negro group is spoken of continually as one undifferentiated low-class mass. So apparently they were still thought of as this during the time this book was published. He talked about this in 1899 with the Philadelphia Negro, and now he's saying it again. Whites lumped all Negroes into one low-class group. That was their reputation in the white mind, which was certainly frustrating to the more cultured and educated Negroes. The culture of the higher whites is often considered as typical of all the whites, which was inaccurate. The whites had their differences as well, which becomes especially apparent once you consider the fact that the white group included millions of recent immigrants from various parts of Europe who were culturally different. Some were more violent, like the Irish and Italians, while others were more centered on education, like the Jews and Germans. But in general, high culture was ascribed often to whites, while low class was placed on all blacks. Thus, considerable intercourse between white and black folk in America is current today, and yet on the whole, the more or less clearly defined upper layers of educated and ambitious Negroes find themselves for the most part largely segregated and alone. They were shut out of the white circles and were unrelatable to the black masses, with few strong institutions of their own to bridge the cultural and class divide. They are unable, or at least unwilling on the terms offered, to share the social institutions of the cultured whites of the nation, and are faced with inner problems of contact with their own lower classes with which they have few or no social institutions capable of dealing. Here's why. The Negro of education and income is jammed beside the careless, ignorant, and criminal. And that's one heck of a place to be jammed in. He recoils from appeal to the white city even for physical protection against his antisocial elements, for this, he feels, is a form of self-accusation, of attack on the Negro race. Even when threatened by crime, the educated Negroes didn't reach out to white authorities, because in doing so, it would appear to be a sense of betrayal, and also a reinforcement of negative stereotypes, which these blacks sought to escape. It invites the smug rejoinder,
"Well, if you can't live with niggers, How do you expect us to?
That's why they didn't want to reach out to the authorities. They might encounter this as a response. For escape of the Negro culture to areas of white culture, with the consequent acceleration of acculturation, there is small opportunity. There is little or no chance for a Negro family to remove to a quiet neighborhood, to a protected suburb or a college town, because most of the black community didn't provide this. It was the opposite. That's why after the Fair Housing Act in 1968 was passed, Negroes really started getting out of there. They had enough, and they finally got their opportunity to flee. I tried once to buy a home in the Sage Foundation development at Forest Hills, Long Island. The project was designed for the class of white-collar workers to which I belonged. Dr. Du Bois was trying to flee. Robert DeForest and his directors hesitated, but finally and definitely refused, simply and solely because of my rich skin. He used the word dark, but we can't cast that spell on the people by using dark to describe his skin color. So we blessed the people by using rich instead. So the people looked at his skin color and said, nope, you can't come live with us. Not next to us. Oh no. We don't care how upstanding you are. And this is why Dr. Du Bois can speak on this black upper class situation with authority, because he was one of the members. He was the first black to graduate from Harvard with a PhD. And he was one of the few white-collar workers in the black community at the time. So he knew exactly the frustration they felt by being stuck between the two worlds. What now is the practical path for the solution of the problem? Usually it has been assumed in such cases that the culture recruits rising from a submerged group will be received more or less willingly by corresponding classes of neighboring or enveloping groups. Of course, it is clear in the case of immigrant groups and other disadvantaged clusters of folk that this process is by no means easy or natural. Much bitter frustration and social upheaval continually arise from the refusal of the upper social layers to receive recruits from below, which was the case with the European immigrants. They had to fight their way into the upper echelons of whiteness. The Irish, the Jews, the Italians, they were all discriminated against at some point and to some degree, all before they were allowed into the club. Nevertheless, in the United States, it has been impossible, long or entirely, to exclude the better classes of the Irish, the Italians, the Southern poor whites. In the case of the Negro, the unwillingness is greater, and public opinion supports it to such a degree that admission of black folk to cultured circles is slow and difficult, which hurt the soul of so many blacks that were dying to be accepted. It still remains possible in the United States for a white American to be a gentleman and a scholar, a Christian and a man of integrity, and yet flatly and openly refuse to treat as a fellow human being any person who has Negro ancestry. That's part of the authentic white consciousness, doing what it was created to do. The inner contradiction and frustration which this involves is curious. The younger educated Negroes show here vastly different interpretations. One avoids every appearance of segregation. He will not sit in a streetcar beside a Negro. He will not frequent a Negro church. He will join few, if any, Negro organizations. On the other hand, he will take every opportunity to join in the political and cultural life of the whites. This type of Negro only wanted to be in the white society, and that was it. Give him white or take his life, because he was not getting down with the blackness. But he pays for this and pays dearly. He so often meets actual insult or more or less veiled rebuffs from the whites that he becomes nervous and truculent through expectation of dislike, even when its manifestation does not always appear. Now, I feel bad for the blacks who had this experience. Trying to be accepted by whites came with the cost of being insulted and demeaned, because whites for sure understood what those blacks were doing. Those blacks carried a vibe on them that could be detected from a mile away. The whites knew they were running from blacks and trying to be accepted by them, and therefore they took advantage of the situation and used insults and subtle disrespects, which happened so much, apparently, that Negroes became nervy and unable to distinguish between when someone was actually insulting them and when they were not. And on the other hand, Negroes more or less withdraw from associating with him. They suspect that he is ashamed of his race. He's cooning or an Uncle Tom,
or a good N-word, and they have no dealings with him or her.
Another sort of young educated Negro forms and joins Negro organizations, prides himself on living with his people, withdraws from contact with whites, unless there is no obvious alternative.
This one wants to show his allegiance to Negroes. He got educated, wants nothing to do with the whites, and returned to be one with the Negroes.
He too pays.
There's a price to pay for this as well. Every decision has trade-offs and consequences. The Negroes who were able to leave the community to be with the whites, they got access to better homes, better schools, and better services, at the expense of being insulted by the whites and distanced from the blacks. But the Negro who returns to the community pays this price.
His cultural contacts sink of necessity to a lower level.
He goes back down into the pit. Why? Because you become most like those who you surround yourself with. So if you decide to party in the pit with the masses of Negroes, then where else do you expect to end up?
He becomes provincial in his outlook.
He becomes narrow-minded from cutting himself off from the broader culture and from surrounding himself all day with the type of Negroes who didn't know much.
He attributes to whites a dislike and hatred and racial prejudice of which many of them are quite unconscious and guiltless. Between these two extremes range all sorts of interracial patterns, and all of them theoretically follow the idea that Negroes must only submit to segregation when forced.
Meaning most of the educated blacks fell somewhere within the range of these two extremes. Not total assimilation into the white society, nor complete withdrawal into black-only spaces. And according to Dr. Du Bois, they followed the principle that blacks must only submit to segregation when forced.
In practically all cases, the net result is a more or less clear and definite crystallization of the culture elements among colored people into their own groups for social and cultural contact.
Due to force and out of necessity, the cultured blacks gradually created their own distinct cultural groups.
The resultant path, which commends itself to many whites, is deliberate and planned cultural segregation of the upper classes of Negroes, not only from the whites of all classes, but from their own masses.
Many whites did not want educated Negroes integrated into their white society, nor influencing the broader black community. They preferred a separate, self-contained Negro elite, cut off from both sides so it posed no threat to either.
It has been said time and time again, if certain classes of Negroes do not like the squalor, filth, and crime of Negro slums, instead of trying to escape to better class white neighborhoods, why do they not establish their own exclusive neighborhoods? In other words, why does not the Negro race build up a class structure of its own, parallel to that of the whites, but separate and including its own social, economic, and religious institutions? The arresting thing about this advice and program is that even when not planned, this is exactly what Negroes are doing, and must do even in the case of those who theoretically resent it. The group with whose conversation this chapter started is a case in point.
That's the group from Commentary 360, who was complaining about blacks being loud and bad-mannered in Harlem.
They form a self-segregated culture group.
Because that's how people will always form groups. The Negro and black identity was thrust upon people who never naturally chose to be a group. So as time goes on, you see it falling apart, because it was an artificial creation from the beginning.
They have come to know each other partly by chance, partly by design, but form a small integrated clique because of similar likes and ideas, because of corresponding culture,
which was natural for them to form on their own.
This is happening all over the land among these 12 million Negroes. It is not a matter yet of a few broad superimposed social classes, but rather of smaller cliques and groups gradually integrating and extending out of their neighborhoods into neighboring districts and cities. In this way, a distinct social grouping has long been growing among American Negroes, and recent studies have emphasized what we all knew, and that is that the education and acculturation of the Negro child is more largely the result of the training through contact with these cultural groups than it is of the caste-conditioned contacts with whites.
The black children from these developing cultural circles were learning their worldview, values, morals, and ethics primarily from other black members of the group rather than from the white society.
The question now comes as to how far this method of acculturation should and could go, and by what conscious planning the uplift of the Negro race can be accomplished through this means. Is cultural separation in the same territory feasible?
He's asking, does this method of self-contained acculturation provide enough power to uplift the race on its own? And is it even possible for blacks and whites to remain culturally separated while living on the same land?
To force a group of various levels of culture to segregate itself will certainly retard its advance, since it must put energy not simply into social advance, but in the vast and intricate effort to duplicate, evolve, and contrive new social institutions to maintain their advance and guard against retrogression.
He thinks it would have required too much energy for a culturally segregated black community to build up the masses, and at the same time, build institutions required to prevent the group from falling back into the pit. He believed that it was too much of a burden and it would have prevented their advancement.
There can be two theories here. One, that the rise of a talented tenth within the Negro race, whether or not it succeeds in escaping to the higher cultural classes of the white race, is a threat to the development of the whole Negro group and hurts their chances for salvation.
The return of the good old talented tenth talk. The first theory is that this elite group of Negroes could grow to become a threat to the masses of blacks. That could happen by them taking off to the white community or staying amongst themselves. Either way, they could become so disconnected from the black masses that they no longer were willing or able to help them.
Or it may be said that the rise of classes within the Negro group is precisely a method by which the level of culture in the whole group is going to be raised.
Or it could have the opposite effect. As the elite class grew, it could set an example for the masses of blacks to follow. And as a result, everyone would rise together.
But this depends upon the relations that develop between these masses and the cultural aims of the higher classes.
It depends on if the elites wanted to take off to be with the whites, if they wanted to stay isolated and disconnected from the masses, or if they stayed grounded with the aim of uplifting the people. And it also depended on how receptive the masses of people were and how they viewed the educated elites as role models. So it worked both ways.
Many assume that an upper social class maintains its status mainly by reason of its superior culture. It may, however, maintain its status because of its wealth and political power, and in that case, its ranks can be successfully invaded only by the wealthy. In white America, it is in this direction that we have undoubtedly changed the older pattern of social hierarchy. Birth and culture still count, but the main avenue to social power and class domination is wealth, income and oligarchic economic power, the consequent political power, and the prestige of those who own and control capital and distribute credit. This makes a less logical social hierarchy and one that can only be penetrated by the will and permission of the ruling oligarchy or the chances of gambling. Education, thrift, hard work, and character undoubtedly are influential, but they are implemented with power only as they gain wealth, and as land, natural resources, credit, and capital are increasingly monopolized, they gain wealth by permission of the dominating wealthy class. If now American Negroes plan a vertical parallel of such a structure and such processes, they will find it practically impossible. First of all, they have not the wealth. Secondly, they have not the political power which wealth manipulates. And in the realm of their democratic power, they are not only already partly disfranchised by law and custom, but they suffer the same general limitation of democratic power in income and industry, in which the white masses are imprisoned.
So basically, he's saying that it would have pretty much been impossible for blacks to copy the white structure because they did not have the wealth or material possessions to do so. And in a sense, they were trapped in a similar position as the poor whites.
There would be greater possibility of the Negro imitating the class structure of the white race if those whites who advise and encourage it were ready to help in its accomplishment, ready to furnish the Negro the broadest opportunity for cultural development, and in addition to this, to open the way for them to accumulate such wealth and receive such income as would make the corresponding structure secure. But, of course, those who most vehemently tell the Negro to develop his own classes and social institutions, have no plan or desire for such help. First of all, and often deliberately, they curtail the education and cultural advantage of black folk, and they do this because they are not convinced of the cultural ability or gift of Negroes, and have no hope nor wish that the mass of Negroes can be raised even as far as the mass of whites have been.
They still held firm to the belief in the inherent black inferiority. So to them, they believed the potential to be raised wasn't even there.
It is this insincere attitude which especially arouses the ire and resentment of the culture groups among American Negroes.
Because they knew they had the talent, but felt as though they were being prevented from fully displaying it.
When the Negro despairs of duplicating white development, his despair is not always because the paths to this development are shut in his face, but back of this lurks too often a lack of faith in essential Negro possibilities, parallel to similar attitudes on the part of the whites.
So sometimes it was about more than not having the opportunity. Some Negroes started to take on the belief of the whites and lose faith in the ability of Negroes as a whole to improve.
Instead of this proving anything concerning the truth, it is simply a natural phenomenon. Negroes, particularly the better class Negroes, are brought up like other Americans despite the various separations and segregations. They share, therefore, average American culture and current American prejudices.
And he should know because he was an insider in that group.
It is almost impossible for a Negro boy trained in a white northern high school and a white college to come out with any high idea of his own people or any abiding faith in what they can do, or for a Negro trained in the segregated schools of the South, wholly to escape the deadening environment of insult and caste, even if he happens to have the good teachers and teaching facilities, which poverty almost invariably denies him. He may rationalize his own individual status as exceptional. He can well believe that there are many other exceptions, but he cannot ordinarily believe that the mass of Negro people have possibilities equal to the whites. It is this sort of thing that leads to the sort of self-criticism that introduces this chapter. My grandfather, Alexander Du Bois, was pushed into the Negro group. He resented it. He wasn't a Negro, he was a man.
Oh, snaps.
He would not attend Negro picnics or join a Negro church, and yet he had to. Now, his situation in 1810 was much different from mine in 1940, because the Negro group today is much more differentiated and has distinct cultural elements. He could go to a Negro picnic today and associate with interesting people of his own level. So much so, indeed, that some Negro thinkers are beginning to be afraid that we will become so enamored of our own internal social contacts that we will cease to hammer at the doors of the larger group, with all the consequent loss of breadth through lack of the widest cultural contact, and all the danger of ultimate extinction through exacerbated racial repulsions and violence. To recapitulate, we cannot follow the class structure of America. We do not have the economic or political power, the ownership of machines and materials, the power to direct the processes of industry, the monopoly of capital and credit. On the other hand, even if we cannot follow this method of structure, nevertheless we must do something. We cannot stand still. We cannot permit ourselves simply to be the victims of exploitation and social exclusion. It is from this paradox that arises the present frustration among American Negroes.
So that was the dilemma with the educated Negroes in the 1930s, trapped between two worlds with no clear path to take, and with a hefty price to pay no matter where they turned. So stay tuned for more because we have more coming up on this chapter in the book, and we'll pick up in the next commentary. And so I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.